and welcome to another Metal Methodologies podcast interview. I'm Owen Coggins, and I'm interviewing leading metal scholars about theory, method, and interdisciplinary research. Today with me is Dr. Ross Hagen, Assistant Professor of Music Studies at Utah Valley University and Communications Officer on the Executive Board of the International Society for Metal Music Studies. Welcome, Ross.
Thank you.
Ross recently authored a book on black metal and borealism, focusing on Darkthrone's A Blaze in the Northern Sky for the 33 1/3 book series on classic albums, and co-edited with Ruth Baratt-Peacock the collection Medievalism and Metal Music, Throwing Down the Gauntlet. Today we'll be talking about borealism, medievalism, and music analysis in metal studies. So firstly, the 33 1/3 book is a really great, thoughtful introduction to black metal overall, as well as a specific look at A Blaze in the Northern Sky. So why did you pick that album as the example?
There were a few reasons. There are lots of different albums or groups that you could look at. And I think part of it was sort of that, if I were to focus on like Mayhem's De Mysterious or something like that, but then it would just be a very different sort of book. And what I liked about A Blaze in the Northern Sky was that I wouldn't necessarily argue, and I don't argue that it's the first black metal album or anything like that, but it was sort of the album that sort of created this platform for black metal, because Darkthrone was already, they were on Peaceville Records, they already had kind of this international audience. And then when this album comes out, they sort of have this much bigger platform at the time than most of the other bands. And I also liked it because it's sort of like this transitional album, because you can sort of hear them trying to create this black metal aesthetic, kind of out of the ashes of this death metal album called Goat Lord that they were working on at the time, and they just abandoned it and then had to kind of scramble to reinvent what they were doing in time for the studio booking. So I like it because you can kind of hear the stitches in it. You can kind of see how it's being put together. I also liked it because whereas you have some groups like Emperor comes to mind as a group that has this kind of forward-looking idea of sort of seeing how far we can take this, what sort of musically interesting things we can do. Darkthrone is even at this point is very kind of nostalgic. They're kind of going back to older Celtic Frost and Bathory and really kind of mining that terrain. And I liked that idea because it seems like that's sort of something that as I sort of looked at their career, it seemed like they've always kind of been doing that. They're still doing that. I felt like A Blaze in the Northern Sky created a really good framework for looking at the creation of black metal, but also kind of looking at what it's become in the decades since.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought was really interesting that you point out that black metal right from these early stages is already nostalgic, which is interesting then thinking about how those albums of the early 90s, particularly from Norway, are treated really nostalgically now by black metal musicians, but pointing out that there was already a looking back even at that legendary mythical foundation point.
Right. I mean, it's also something that I'll have to put this in the references because the actual title of the article is fallen out of my head, but this idea that they're kind of mining this side of extreme metal that had really been kind of disparaged up to that point. And they sort of created an alternative narrative around what extreme metal should be and could be.
So one of the key concepts that you articulate in the book is borealism. So what is borealism? Where does the idea come from? Where else has it been used? And how does it help us to understand what's going on in black metal?
So borealism is basically a version of Edward Said's Orientalism, but specifically geared towards the Nordic regions and the Arctic. Orientalism, as Said puts it, that is sort of this self-conception in continental Europe, mostly taking place during the Enlightenment, that if you look at 18th and 19th century artwork, literature and music that portrays Asian cultures and African cultures and Middle Eastern cultures, there's this really patronizing and sort of sexualized kind of conception that, lots of, harem girls and all kinds of stuff. And for Said, it's a way for the folks in continental Europe to kind of define themselves negatively against that. This is what we're not. and look at how awful this stuff is, but ooh, isn't it titillating too? But that kind of thing, which turns up in, exoticized, like, operas and paintings and all kinds of stuff. But that kind of conception was also applied, to people right next door, to people up in the Nordic regions, also to Eastern Europeans and Russians. And so basically, it sort of applies that idea that if you look at histories of Nordic music, especially once it starts to sort of enter into the notated tradition, that, you have these sort of folk songs that are kind of praised for being kind of like naive sounding. There's this kind of like patronizing tone to it that, these people are kind of like provincial. And of course, and the Nordic regions also, of course, have their own history of being colonial outposts of variously, mostly Sweden and Denmark. And so it's this way of sort of conceiving of the Nordic region as being sort of separate from continental Europe. But it also has, in a lot of literature, this kind of sense of danger to it. That's like the edge of the world where all kinds of weird things can happen. The thing that comes to mind for me a lot is the ending of the novel Frankenstein, that ends with, Victor and his creature sort of in pursuit of each other, like across the Arctic, that it's sort of like a place of monsters. And you can also see that in things like Game of Thrones and all sort, like even in imaginary polar regions. But for Norway in particular, as they were in the process of kind of creating themselves as a nation in the 19th century and sort of creating this identity apart from Sweden, that sense of being apart from the rest of quote unquote civilized Europe fed into a lot of their national mythology, that it has this kind of rugged outdoor kind of outsiderness to it that becomes sort of a sense of self-identification. And so it kind of plays into the sort of popular music narrative around black metal, this kind of like exoticized kind of thing, which in the book I connected to the wider world music industry that very much focuses on supposedly authentic music from this exotic and potentially maybe a bit dangerous place that is really aimed not so much at the people living in that place, but at people who don't live there, at a cosmopolitan audience in Europe and in the United States. And so for Norwegian black metal, when I was thinking about it, well, I guess like one of the things that I like about the 33 1/3 series is that it does sort of encourage a bit of personal reflection, more so than sort of a standard academic monograph normally would. And so I was sort of thinking back of like my own sort of first encounter with this music, and when I was living in suburban Oklahoma, and it seemed so strange and like alien, but really compelling because of that. And so I could sort of see how that appealed to me as a teenage metalhead. But then I kept seeing like the ways that bands and the metal sort of media capitalizes on that over and over again. I don't think this made it into the book, but one of my favorite examples of that is there's a Norwegian talk show. It's hosted by the guy who's the bassist in Turbo Negro, and he's friends with Necro Butcher from Mayhem. And so he actually follows them on tour through Central and South America. So they're playing like Colombia, like Costa Rica, Mexico City. And there's a point where he's talking with these Costa Rican Mayhem fans outside, and he's kind of playing with them. Like it feels like a little bit like he's sort of baiting them a little bit. He's like, well, where do you think Necro Butcher lives? And this one guy's like, I think he lives in a cave. And the guy's like, oh yeah, like in a cave with like a cape. And it's like, yeah, and lots of like candles. And it feels like, on the one hand, it almost felt like it had a little bit of like a heavy metal parking lot kind of vibe to it. But then I also realized that, no, like this guy doesn't actually believe that. It's just a sort of agreed upon fantasy. Like it's fun to imagine that.
That we're all kind of playing along because that's part of the imaginary that we're all familiar with, and that's you kind of can participate in that by pretending that everybody lives in grim and frostbitten cabins.
Right. That's part of its appeal kind of outside of that. I guess in terms of where I sort of got familiarized, I guess, with the Borealism concept was in Fabian Holt, who's actually editing the 33 1/3 Europe series, but he also edited the Oxford Handbook of Popular Music in the Nordic Countries, which there's several chapters in that really dive into this. But it also sort of does create this idea that, like talking about sort of with this fantasy, that if you listen to a piece of music and you're expecting to hear northernness, if you're like primed to hear that, you're not going to be disappointed. Just sort of thinking of Norwegian black metal in a global sense, I felt like the concept really kind of tied together a lot of distinct things about it, I think.
Mm-hmm. I imagine a lot of people will be familiar with, the album covers with mountains and forests and the moon, the track titles and so on. But how exactly is Borealism evoked in the musical sounds? How do the sounds and musical structures connect to those more cultural ideas about northernness and landscapes and so on?
It is kind of, again, this sort of like agreed upon sort of musical trope. A lot of the ways we talk about music and understand it, there's already like a layer of metaphor and symbolism in it.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of no matter what kind of language or jargon you're using. Think about when someone's like, oh yeah, that riff is really frosty. And like, we know what that sounds like. If you're familiar with the style of music, like that evokes something. But you could evoke the same thing by saying, well, it's a minor chord that moves from minor 1 to minor 3 in parallel motion, but you're still kind of relying on this sort of layer of metaphor to it. It's just sort of speaking a more jargony language. And it's something that I was thinking of it in relationship to other kinds of music. The one that comes to mind for me is how if we hear clean guitar with like tremolo and like kind of saturated and reverb, it somehow sounds desert-y to us. Mm-hmm. Which is probably, I think, thanks to Ennio Morricone and Sergio Leone and spaghetti westerns. Mm-hmm. The sort of film music analogy is one of the ways that I sort of got thinking about it, because sort of everybody understands like sort of the language of film music. Like you hear a piece of music from a movie and you can, within a pretty short period of time, you can tell if you're dealing with an action movie, a comedy, or a romance, because we all sort of understand how that music sounds.
And because those conventions are repeated to us so often, like in 100 adverts or a TV show, and they just become shorthand for particular environments or so on.
Yeah, and so I think the connection between the sort of music and landscapes and geographies and things like that, it's not solid, it's symbolic. But I feel like it's, this sort of subcultural trope that is a big part of how we hear that music. Mm-hmm. Now. When you have bands who have this kind of, with these artworks and lyrics and song titles, I mean, you sort of naturally associate that visual with whatever the music is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I suppose you could say that things like heavy distortion and kind of indecipherability of certain sounds could also perhaps relate to the ideas about the kind of mysterious and dangerous north, that it's a bit mysterious because you can't necessarily hear exactly what's going on or what people are saying. And then I suppose the recording quality is being kind of described as rough and primitive. That kind of connects to an othering idea of wild northerners.
Something goes from just sounding bad to sounding freezing.
Yeah, and then that also becomes something that people build on in order to kind of articulate their shared values of valuing things that other people don't value, and kind of creating an idea of a community that surrounds this kind of music as something we like and other people don't necessarily value.
Right. One of the things I like about it is that you can also use it in kind of a playful manner too. Like it doesn't have to be deadly serious kind of association that people can approach in all kinds of different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's an interesting relation to things being kind of pushed to extremes and things being funny or absurd. And the example you mentioned about like the Costa Rican fans imagining Necrobutcher in a cave, that doesn't necessarily have to rely on a true belief that he really does live in a cave, but that's part of the imaginary that we enjoy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think one of the challenges is the issue we're discussing, connecting specific musical details to these wider abstract ideas. In your chapter in the Medievalism book that we'll talk about in a moment, you mentioned that this musical analysis has not always been a strength of metal studies. Why do you think that is? Why is musical analysis so important for metal studies to engage with?
Well, I think a lot of it just sort of comes from the genesis of metal studies as a field. when it sort of first got started, a lot of it was dealing with more cultural studies and sociology and political science kinds of viewpoints, which actually, oddly enough, I think is something that, when we look at sort of music analysis and writing about music, that's often kind of the way it goes, that the people who are in music theory and musicology often will sort of get to those sorts of new terrains a lot of time kind of after folks in other disciplines have gotten there first. Well, I guess the example that comes to mind for me is feminist criticism. Didn't really emerge in musicology and music theory until kind of like the early 90s. But if you had been studying literature, history, or anything like that, it had been around for a long, long time prior to that.
And even in cultural studies or subcultural studies, like studies of punk right from the beginning,
Right.
like Dick Hebdige's book, it's all about fashion really, rather than musical sound. That kind of comes later. Perhaps maybe because that's easier to grapple with than musical sound somehow.
I think it is. I mean, kind of like we were talking about earlier, that music analysis has its own very particular jargon to it, and it's very easy to get into very technical language very quickly.
Also perhaps the language and the frameworks that are used, inherited from discussing Western classical music, aren't necessarily the best tools for discussing what's important about metal music, or some of the things that are really important, like tempo and distortion and so on.
Yeah, it's definitely, I mean, those tools have their place, but they're not the final answer to what the musical experience is. They can illuminate some things, I think, but you also don't want to think that you've articulated that and that's all that's happening.
Mm-hmm. It's a great argument for interdisciplinary research right there. So given the really strong interdisciplinarity of metal studies, what suggestions do you have for people without so much of a musical analysis research background to bring in consideration of the musical sounds to their research?
Given the wide range of disciplines in metal studies, that a lot of it kind of depends on specifically what it is about metal they're researching, because it might not really be necessary. But I do think that one way to consider it is to just sort of remember that this sort of endeavor of people playing and recording and listening to music is kind of the center of gravity.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you're not talking about that specifically, I think it's good to keep that in mind. Not necessarily that anybody isn't.
There are lots of other questions about metal that don't necessarily deal directly with the musical sound, but whatever questions are asked about metal, for the people who are involved in metal, almost everybody is going to say that the music is the center of whatever kind of cultural activities and behaviors people are actually doing.
Yeah. And I think as far as models for analysis are good resources, I'm still kind of a fan of Walser's book. I think it's a good place to start. I really like Glenn Pillsbury's book on Metallica.
Yeah.
Damage Incorporated, which kind of builds on a lot of the things Walser was doing. But it's sort of this, kind of gets into these ideas of how like particular musical gestures sort of generate meaning through our understandings of it.
What I like about both of those is that they both have examples where the musical sounds, the musical settings might kind of slightly subvert the actual lyrical meanings. So I think that's really, really valuable.
Exactly. How the music itself and the way the music is constructed kind of adds to what's happening in it. One of the things that I've kind of gotten interested in lately is also this sort of sense of really kind of focusing on the instruments themselves a little bit, and kind of how they have this role in sort of determining how the music is made and how it behaves. I think Steve Waxman's book on the electric guitar, Instruments of Desire, is really great for that. And there also are a couple of new cultural histories coming out later this year, one on drum kits and one on the bass guitar. Not necessarily for everybody, depending on what they're studying, but that's sort of a part of music making that a lot of musicologists and music analysts, I guess, music theorists are kind of beginning to dig into that a little bit more and kind of appreciate how the instruments themselves can kind of determine or maybe not determine, but at least kind of shuttle music in particular directions or kind of channel it.
I'd like to see a cultural history of the amplifier as well as something separate from a electric guitar. I think that would be interesting.
I think that if somebody hasn't done that already, I'm pretty sure it's in the mix, I would imagine.
Yeah, speaking of instruments, you mentioned in the book that you're in a black metal band. So I wanted to ask, does playing influence research thinking, and does the research you're doing influence your musical output?
I could say actually playing really did. It has given me a lot of insights that I don't think I would have gotten otherwise, just as a listener. And again, it kind of goes back to the mechanics of the instrument and the mechanics of playing in an ensemble. That, one of the things I've come to appreciate is how songwriting in extreme metal, sometimes it's kind of determined by the physical demands of the piece. You might have to have a slower part here, not just because it artistically works, but because if we're going to make it to the end of the song, like we have to have a breakdown here or something. It's also something that, I've really come to appreciate the role of the drummer a lot more. I remember when I was sort of first beginning to write about black metal, I was kind of taken with the monotony of things like early Birdsum or Transylvanian Hunger, where you had this like really monotonous kind of beat that had very little articulation to it. But if you were a drummer playing in an ensemble, which with those albums, one of the things I kind of appreciate is those are albums that, were made essentially by one musician with no intention ever of playing it live. They're sort of able to have that kind of monotony. Whereas if a drummer played like that live, well, first of all, a drummer wouldn't play like that live, I don't think. If they did, it would be very hard to keep track of where one is. And so the drummer in my band and every other like really good metal drummer has these, these like little cues and like, that there's like this flow to it just because you're humans playing in an ensemble and you have to try to keep together. And so that's the main thing that I've sort of come to appreciate from playing in an ensemble rather than doing things with like a drum machine or just like listening to things.
Mark Minet's work is really interesting
Yes.
in that respect, in terms of the recording aspect of things for a different kind of extreme metal, but
yeah.
where in the studios you get like kick drums on record that are played faster than it is physically possible to play. And how that kind of relates to the different ideas about authenticity and the relationship between the live versions and studio versions.
Well, and even in Jason Netherton's Extremity Retained, like he even talks about how even back in the 90s at Morrisound, I mean, they were doing it on tape, but they were still doing drum replacements and things like that, even back then, just to try and even the sound out. And yeah, so I like really come to appreciate that aspect to it in a way that if I weren't playing this kind of music in a band, I think it wouldn't have been as easy for me to realize those kinds of things. As far as like the second part of your question about whether it influences my musical output, I don't know if it does or not. I just kind of think of the research as like, sometimes it'll give me a new idea that I can kick around that most of the time won't turn into anything good, but maybe and it probably just makes me think about it all too hard.
Yeah. Okay, so moving to another kind of notorious aspect of extremism. Talking about black metal, you write, it's almost impossible not to lead with the violence, even when discussing figures like Darkthrone who weren't directly involved in it, thinking about the suicide, murder and arson and so on that went on in Norway in the 1990s. But that's only part of the story, and in your view, again a quote, some of the most interesting things happen after the criminals have been removed from the scene and those who are left have to figure out what to do now. Now, I've found myself in writing articles or chapters or whatever about black metal, really trying to have to sort of explain to readers who might not be familiar with it that history, which is necessary, is necessary context, but without overly sensationalizing, but also not glossing over how extreme some of that stuff was. So I guess this fits into a wider question about history and mythology. How can researchers deal with those important but also really well-trodden and standardized areas of history without just kind of rote repetition of the tall tales that everybody knows?
Yeah, I don't know if I have an answer really for that, as far as just setting aside a certain amount of your word count to just know that you need to. And, I do sort of share this frustration from writing about this, that, you do sort of have to tell the same story over and over again. And like, I almost kind of wish that we could all agree on like some kind of boilerplate that we could just paste in.
If you don't know about all the church burnings and murder, just go here and read the standard.
Read those. But, one of the things that, as I was, sort of researching this and writing this, especially actually that Norwegian TV show kind of following Necrobutcher around, seeing how like he really, I think, especially, with the suicide of Perin the Olin dead, that, there's a fair bit of like kind of survivor's guilt, or it seems like it anyway. And that, they'll be like Mayhem will be playing a concert. And I mean, when they came to Salt Lake City, like I had an acquaintance here who had, on his battle vest, his huge back patch was like the picture of dead with his brains all over the place. I mean, Necrobutcher talks about how much that affects him and that it used to really piss him off, but now he's kind of just like, well, like I sort of have to just deal with it. Like I can't try to fight everybody who's selling these kinds of things outside of shows. And so I guess one of the things that I have kind of come to feel is that, even though we get kind of frustrated about, having to like repeat this mythology, we also like can't pretend that big part of the genre's notoriety, rests on these graves.
Mm-hmm.
And so like on the one hand, like I kind of wish we could just like, take it and just like make a footnote out of it. But at the same time, that doesn't feel sort of ethically right.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of why, I tried to get at this a little bit in the Darkthrone book, because honestly, it is one of those things where, I think of it sort of with this metaphor of like a spotlight that, sort of shine like that part has had this spotlight for so long, but when you have the spotlight, it throws everything else into shadow and you can't see anything else.
Mm-hmm.
And so I sort of wanted to, I don't know, like bring the house lights up a little bit. And I also think one of the things that I think that mythology does, and it's also why I think it's important to sort of interrogate it a little bit, is that I think that it has this outsized profile just because how could it not?
Mm-hmm.
But you don't want to make sort of that brief period of, actual violence, like that can't be the apex of it. Because, I mean, there's so much more possibility in this musical style. And, and I know that some musicians and, other metal scholars like Keith Kahn-Harris sort of talk about how it's like it sort of creates this limit that, if that's what it has to be, then you get kind of stuck. As Keith put it, it's like, how you can't do anything more transgressive than that.
It creates a mythology about the music being all about transgression, but it's always going to be kind of attempting to almost digest this kind of shattering event.
It's also, on the one hand, I also think that, and I appreciate this because actually one of the early reviews of the Darkthrone book kind of mentions this, that I think metalheads are also like, we're kind of tired of reading about it too.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we sort of have to write for a wider audience. And I also, kind of think of myself as an academic, that there's also kind of the secret audience I'm writing for, which is my tenure committee.
Mm-hmm.
And other like university administrators and people like that who we sort of have to explain ourselves to.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there is that in the back of my mind, at least.
So speaking of history, it struck me while reading the Medievalism collection right after the Darkthrone book that they were similar in a way. One of them exploring how metal draws on a particular geographical location, a kind of imaginary one, that's overloaded with romanticized fantasies. And the other, the book about medievalism, investigates how metal makes use of a particular historical period that's also distant and partly unknowable, and similarly liable to have all kinds of imaginary values and ideas built around it. So can you explain how the Medievalism book, the edited collection with Ruth Baratt-Peacock, how the book uses the ideas of medievalism and neo-medievalism?
Okay, yeah. So in editing this, like one of the things that and kind of diving into the world of medievalism, which, when I sort of started this was kind of a bit of a new territory for me, although I'd done a fair bit of graduate work in early music. But one of the things about medievalism is that it's like Borealism in some ways, in that it is really very sort of flexible, that it becomes this sort of catch-all for anything that seems not of modern civilization, like the North and Borealism. This is like this other time. And it's really kind of contradictory in a lot of ways. In some ways it has this sort of idea that it's kind of noble, but there's also sort of this layer of brutality over it, especially the way metal uses it. And actually one of the things that I noticed recently is that, when we are now in the United States, sort of seeing the body cam footage of the Capitol police officers trying to fight off the people who were, trying to force their way into the Capitol, that, it's this footage of, really intense hand-to-hand combat. And so many commentators said that it looked medieval. And so it has this, again, this kind of sense of brutality, but also this sense of authenticity to it, I think.
Heroic battles, as well as acknowledging the violence and superstition,
and that the violence is face to face and hand to hand instead of at a distance. But with neo-medievalism, this was sort of an interesting debate in medieval studies, that neo-medievalism, I think the best way to describe it is that it's like a layer that kind of accretes onto an earlier medievalism. Which itself might be built on actual medieval material, or at least on like an idea of what the medieval era was like. And honestly, I think like a lot of metal that deals with sort of ideas of the medieval is really kind of dealing with neo-medieval kinds of things, basing their narratives and their ideas on pre-existing products that were then based on the medieval period.
In a similar way to a lot of the Viking imaginary is, in fact, kind of derived a lot from 19th century imaginings of the Vikings,
right?
Which had a tenuous but not particularly kind of historically grounded link to the actual Vikings.
Right. I think my favorite media example of neo-medievalism is probably The Princess Bride, where it's like, this medievalist romance that's a parody of medievalist romances. It builds on a modern idea of what medieval is and what it means, which is, again, very flexible.
So there's chapters in the book about black metal uses of the medieval style woodcuts in the imagery. There's connections to the medieval market scene in Germany. One of my favorite chapters is about what Brenda Gardner Walters calls Bowerism, which connects black metal to medievalism via Bakhtin's carnival grotesque. So there's a range in the book, but I wondered whether you could talk a bit about how metal kind of approaches this medievalism or neo-medievalism, specifically in music and sound.
This is where I find the sort of neo-medieval idea, because a lot of the things that we sort of interpret as medieval in popular culture aren't really specifically medieval themselves. A lot of it would be that you might have particular acoustic instruments, things that sound sort of folk-ish, or a lot of times the point of reference seems to be things like sword and sorcery film scores, or like dungeon crawler video games. And so like a lot of the heavy lifting in creating this medieval idea is in the album art and lyrics, but then in these things that reference other modern medievalist products. And in my chapter in that, one of the things that is interesting is how you do have metal bands who do engage with the medieval repertoire, specifically doing versions of Palestina Lead. There's several metal versions of that. It's an old crusade song with a few very problematic verses and a few other pieces, but a lot of those are pieces more from the secular repertoire, which we don't really have very many examples of. But a lot of the sort of the aesthetic of medieval music and of early music, just compositionally, is really kind of a poor fit with rock and metal. Just the way it treats rhythm and the way it treats the different musical lines within it, especially once you start getting into choral and polyphonic repertoire, which some of it is very complicated musically. And at least with the band that I wrote about, Obsequiae, which, is kind of thankful to the main songwriter, and that Tanner Anderson was able to actually talk with him about it, because he's coming at it from a much more kind of abstract angle, like without actually engaging with the medieval repertoire itself in the metal pieces, although he does do guitar and harp arrangements of actual medieval repertoire. But when the metal band is happening, it's again much more abstract. You kind of pointed me to like a few pieces that would sort of see that the guitar parts in this song kind of act like the way the voices move in a particular piece from the medieval period. But again, it's a much more elusive sort of connection.
Because of course there isn't authentic electrically amplified medieval music. So always kind of anything that's medieval and metal is always necessarily going to be a question of what medieval material is used and how that gap is bridged and negotiated and navigated, and what the different priorities might be.
Yep. And again, it's sort of like the Borealism thing that, if you're primed to hear it as medieval, you're gonna hear the medieval period, no matter what that means to you.
Mm-hmm. So the introduction of the book raises an issue in medievalism, and this is another quote: "Retrotopian visions of the medieval period are almost invariably visions of white supremacy and exclusivity, and they are also often explicitly masculinist in their desire to reassert heteronormative male dominance in society." And I was thinking this could also overlap with Borealism, given that the North, imagined in a lot of black metal, might implicitly be a sort of vaguely archaic past North. Medievalism is often assumed to mean maybe a pagan, maybe Christianish, but probably Northern European, probably white medieval context. So how do these concepts, Borealism and medievalism, frame research on metal? And how do we deal with their Eurocentric implications when, on one hand, it's obvious that those themes are important in metal, but on the other, we want to avoid framing metal as essentially white, essentially Western, male, Northern European, and so on?
Right. It was definitely a question that came up when we were editing the medieval book, that we kind of allude to this in the introduction, but we did sort of wish that we had managed to get a chapter of someone writing on medievalism outside of Europe, and we just weren't able to find anybody to do it, because it does create a problem. I guess what I would hope would be that just like ism part of Borealism and medievalism gives us sort of a way to clarify that, we're talking about these various like perceptions about the medieval period and the North that aren't real and aren't reflective of reality. But at the same time, they're not meaningless to metal musicians and fans and academics. And so it's, one of these things where I'm sort of hoping that, maybe by dealing with these perceptions, it gives us a way to talk about that tendency to frame metal in that way, and gives some language for interrogating that and questioning it.
Mm-hmm. They're not essentially like that. They could have been constructed otherwise.
With medievalism especially, there is a lot of institutional inertia around those kinds of conceptions as well. I think this is maybe 5 or 10 years old. I can't remember which, but there was a fairly really nasty battle around medieval scholars questioning sort of the whiteness and the Christianness of medievalism as a field itself. And there were definitely some very entrenched sort of institutional positions there. Again, kind of acknowledging the inertia and the power of those conceptions is hopefully a way to kind of start to talk about them and question them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, we're coming to the end now. So the final question, as always, is you have to recommend some medieval metal and some boreal metal.
Well, I already mentioned Obsequiae. They're kind of my go-to because they've really created a really distinct kind of musical aesthetic that really sounds quite different from anything else, from any other metal. Kind of the way that the guitars and basses work, they behave in rather different ways that I find really, really compelling to listen to. I guess I also like the newest Stormkeep album, even though it's medievalist mostly in its relationship to Dungeon Synth and its artwork, but it's really, really great. As far as boreal metal, I think probably my favorite most recently, it kind of wears it on its sleeve, is the Birknagar album True North, which, I mean, it kind of says it all, but yeah, there's songs on that just like make me want to like carve an axe out of ice and like ride a polar bear or something. It definitely wears the borealism on its sleeve, but they do it really, really well.
My thoughts on that were for medieval metal, I'm going to suggest Monos, a funeral doom band from France, just because lots of bands use the sort of medieval woodcut kind of thing, but on their album covers they have these sort of gold details and handwritten black letter calligraphy, making it look like an old manuscript, and everything's in Latin. And the sort of mumbling dirges give a real sense of superstition. And for boreal metal, I was thinking one of the things that, as you were saying about the borealism being this kind of imaginary space that's kind of beyond north, is that one of the things I like about the Nordic black metal is that there's a few references to Transylvania, in Transylvanian Hunger and the band Carpathian Forest. So I'm going to suggest a band from Carpathia, which is the Hungarian band Marble Bog, and their album Forest Heart.
Right on.
Okay, so we've reached the end of this episode. Thanks very much to Dr. Ross Hagen. And there will be references at the end of the video and in the description. And for more information on the International Society for Metal Music Studies, visit the website at metalstudies.org. Thanks to Heretic Temple for the riff, and we'll see you next time.
All right, cheers. Thank you.